Hi, I'm Ed Amoroso, and I want to welcome you to our video interview and discussion series. And I'm here with Nasser Memon, our professor here at NYU, Computer Science Department. And thanks for spending some time here.
Sure, my pleasure.
How many years have you been at NYU?
Oh,
And Poly before that?
18?
18 years.
Yes.
I'll be darned. How did you get into computer science? What brought you to that? And what brought you to ultimately to academia? What was your journey?
That's interesting. So I did a computer science course as an undergrad in my second year where we did not have computers. We wrote programs on paper. Yeah, the TA would look at it and say, yep, that's right. And that was about it.
Really?
That was it.
What programming language were you using?
So we started off with machine language, then assembler, then Pascal, then Fortran, all in one course. And it was a bottom-up approach as opposed to a top-down approach that we do these days. And I wonder if maybe the bottom-up is the right way to go.
I think it probably is.
Right.
I learned
machine
assembler,
language was the
of
first
course.
thing. Yeah.
And Pascal, right?
Right.
Pascal was, it's hard to get programs to actually run.
Right.
Because it would check to make sure that you did it right. Unlike C, where everything runs. Right?
Sure, but for us it was the TA who was checking, so there was no compiler. I'd never compiled a program.
I'll be darned.
And I was good at it, but I was not a very good student in my undergrad.
No.
I was not going to classes. And I graduated with a very, very bad GPA of 2.2. But computer science was one course where I could get a B, and B was a very good grade for me in those days without ever going to class.
Really?
Right. And it just came very naturally. And then later on in life, when I became serious and I thought maybe I should do a master's degree, and nobody in India would admit me because I had such a bad undergrad GPA. And I wrote the GRE and I aced it. I did very well in the GRE, but still nobody would take me. And University of Nebraska here admitted me in computer science. That's when I decided to explore computer science because I recalled how easy it was for me as an undergrad.
And probably very interesting.
And very interesting. And so I started my master's in computer science in Nebraska. Right. And I had no intention of being in academia. I never thought about it. It was not as if I did not want to or something. I just hadn't thought about it.
What was it like landing in Nebraska for the first time?
After Bombay, it was insane. It was a total cultural shock.
Did you have a winter coat?
Landed up in September, right? So August, actually. Yeah. So it was warm.
So you didn't need it then?
No.
But by December
By December, I remember walking out without a sweater out of my apartment and come running back in because it was so cold. I didn't expect it.
So Nebraska to NYU, how did you come to New York City?
Careers take you in different directions, and New York City is, what should I say, a city that many people aspire to go to or look forward to moving to. So those were just career opportunities. So I started off teaching in Arkansas. And from there I moved to Illinois, and then from Illinois I came to New York.
Yeah. Now, cybersecurity became an interest at some point.
So I started off, my first interest started in cryptography. Yeah. So I did my master's thesis in cryptography. I remember attending the crypto conference in Santa Barbara in '89, and I presented my paper on
People
cryptography.
People were exploring the public key cryptography.
At that time,
right?
yes.
Yeah,
at that time,
we didn't know what was going to happen there.
Yeah. That was around the time, and a lot of the cryptography that was being done was based on number theory. Yeah. And my advisor was a group theorist. And so we came up with a technique based on group theory. It was not public key yet.
You could generate a pair with using group theory?
You could take a group and factor it.
Oh, okay.
And then it was like solving the knapsack problem.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's cool. Yeah. Anybody use it? Like, did it realize itself in a product?
Lots of papers were written about it, but no, I don't know
if
it works,
right?
Sure.
So that was your first intro to cybersecurity.
Yes, in that sense. And then I moved away into the world of image compression. I was I developed image compression algorithms. I participated in JPEG, in the image compression standard. And then the imaging world started seeing watermarking, which was kind of a security problem.
It is.
Right? So I got attracted to that and started working in that. And then I came here to Brooklyn, and they had a course in information security and privacy, which they hadn't taught for a long time. And they asked me, why don't you teach it? Because you've done crypto before. Because to them, crypto and security was the same thing.
Synonymous.
Yeah,
Still is to a lot of people.
I know, unfortunately.
We need to fix that, right?
Right,
but
right.
It is still.
Right.
It is
so I started teaching it, and then I realized that you can't teach security by just talking about it. You actually have to break things. You have to actually build things. You have to actually get your hands dirty with stuff, because that's where you understand where the problems happen. So I started a little lab. When I joined here, they'd given me a startup money, and I spent my own money to start a little lab. I got one of the students, he's now a CISO in a big bank, to be the TA, and he was actually doing the class, and for being a TA, he didn't have to do the homeworks because he helped me grade them and design them. And we set up a little room and had created a nice series of labs for the course. And the course was very popular. The students really had a lot of fun doing it. And then I asked myself, you know what? Why not I start a real lab in cybersecurity? So way back in 2000, before security was that an important concern, we started a cybersecurity lab here and started teaching one of the first undergraduate courses in computer security in 2000. So I got some funding from the National Science Foundation to start a sequence of courses in computer security and network security. And then we started this lab, which we called the Information Systems and Internet Security Lab. And after that, it just kept growing every year.
It's continuing to grow. Tell us, so today, what are some of the ways that you describe the program? Is it a lot of students, a lot of courses? I would imagine.
Sure. It's a very active and robust program, right? So it's sort of course, being a research university, we have as many as close to a dozen faculty members who work in areas related to security, and about 50 PhD students who are active in the domain. And then we have a very robust Masters in Cybersecurity program, which sees 100 to 200 students, which is offered online as well as on campus and various combinations. And then there are lots of Masters in Computer Science students who simply take a lot of cybersecurity courses. So they may not graduate with the degree in cybersecurity, but essentially they get a degree in computer science and take most of their courses in cybersecurity. We offer almost a dozen different courses. Awesome. And then in the undergrad, we have a minor in cybersecurity. And then we also, it's not just research and education, but we also reach out to the rest of the community. We have high school students every summer coming here for summer camps. High school teachers, we teach them cybersecurity so they can go and teach their own students. Even 2-year, 4-year college faculty come here in the summers and we share our curriculum with them so they can go back and teach their students. We also reach out to the rest of the world. We organize this Seesaw event, which next year will be running in 5 countries. And we'll reach
Seesaw being a lot of poster sessions with judges and winners.
Capture the flag.
Yeah, it's very exciting. I've been one of your judges.
Hack the chip competition.
It's a wonderful.
So we reach out and touch the rest of the world as well in many different ways. And events like Seesaw have literally brought people to the discipline in the sense after participating in Seesaw, they say, hey, security is such a cool thing. Maybe I should become a security engineer. And it has led to sort of this increase in interest in cybersecurity among students.
Exciting. Now, this Coursera that we're doing, you and I chatted about it months and months ago before we started planning, and here we are. I guess online learning and kind of partnership with some of the really great online learning companies like Coursera I guess that's part of what NYU's mission is at this point, trying to expand and grow the ecosystem.
Right. So online is a way where we can reach out and touch a much larger audience.
Much larger,
right.
The whole group, our community watching this video.
That's right. And we can reach out and give them a good idea as to what are the main problems in cybersecurity, as you've done so in this course so wonderfully. Hopefully. I know. And perhaps get them interested in doing cybersecurity as well. So that's one reason for going online. You can reach a much broader audience and at very low cost. And the second, of course, is that I sincerely believe that technology allows you to create better courses pedagogically. Concepts like adaptive learning, active learning, mastery learning, and things of that sort, which have been shown to be very effective ways of getting across learning experiences. Technology allows us to do that, and I think technology will completely reshape education in the next decade or so. And NYU wants to be
both the on-campus and technology and online. I think that's the future of learning, right?
Yes.
So for youngsters or others watching who at some point would love to be part of the NYU community, this is probably a way of getting started, right? Just sort of immersing in
to see if this is something that interests them, if they have this is what they have an aptitude for, they have an interest in, and if it excites them, then they can start taking courses and start joining a degree program, any degree program, and NYU could be one of them.
I want to ask you a question. I want to put you on the spot, but I've noticed that globally, I'd say at the PhD level, young ladies there seem to be fewer women going into some of the master's and PhD programs in computer science. I watched those indices carefully. Do you think we need to reinvigorate a little bit? And it's sort of been my observation that we made a lot of progress in the 80s, 90s. It feels like it's sagging a little bit right now. I don't know if you've seen that at all.
It's picking up.
Is it picking up?
Yes.
I'm glad to hear that.
It's picking up. So I was the department I was the department head for 3 years. Just finished my term last year. And one of the major initiatives I had started was increasing the women enrollment and participation.
Need to do that. They bring a perspective to what we do.
You know what's the good news? 46% this year.
In
women.
Your program.
Yes,
that's
coming
good
in.
To hear.
Coming in.
That's
46%.
That sounds like good news.
Yes. I don't take the credit for it. I think there's a nationwide trend going on, which is seeing more women coming into computer science.
I have been looking at it. It strikes me.
But we worked very hard. I used to send every single women admit a personal letter. And it's not simply about admitting them. It's also about keeping them, nurturing them, providing the right environment. And so an environment which respects them and allows them to flourish. And I believe we try to do that here at NYU.
Are you teaching anything this semester at all?
No.
How about next semester? Got some plans?
So next semester I'm teaching a course called Cybersecurity Law and Technology.
It's in the
NYU Law School.
Really?
Yes, it's me and a lawyer together jointly teaching the course. Half the students will be from law school, half the students from technology school, and they will be doing joint projects together. So
you're going to be going from the speed of light to the speed of lawyers. That's a pretty dramatic. I'm stealing that line from my friend Duncan Sparrow.
Oh, okay.
It's a good line.
It's a good line. In fact, it's part of, we are starting a new online blended program in cybersecurity risk and strategy, which half the courses in the master's program are law school courses, half are technology courses. And we will not shy away from technology. The lawyers will have to learn it. We will not dilute it, and the technologists will have to learn law. I mean, they will not dilute that.
That's quite an experiment.
So, yes.
You might have a big war in the middle of the classroom, right?
I don't know.
You have to let me know how that goes.
Yeah.
That sounds like fun. Right. Hey, did you enjoy our sit down here?
Of course, every time. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
It's always a pleasure talking to my boss.
Well, in a very narrow context.
Well, not so narrow. I love being here. I love being part of the team. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Great. And we'll see you next time. Hi, in this video I want to talk about another worm in 2003 called Nachi. Now this is a crazy one. Here's how this one worked essentially. There'd been infections, malware infections that had been occurring through 2003. It was a big year for malware infections for whatever reason. It seemed like people were not patching properly, and a lot of the offense noticed that they could break into systems through unpatched vulnerabilities. So we saw a lot of issues, particularly with worms. Well, one of them that popped up is this worm called the Nachi worm. Now, this is an interesting one because it basically is a vigilante worm. If you're familiar with that concept, that means a good guy writing something, in this case a worm, presumably to go out and find problems and fix them. I know that seems like a noble goal, but it turned out to be a complete mess. And I want to tell you some of the building blocks involved in this Nachi worm. So the first thing is that whoever wrote this worm, and by the way, a lot of these attacks are still completely non-attributable. You know, that's one of the challenges that we have in cybersecurity is that a lot of these unsolved crimes that go on for many, many years or decades or forever without knowing who actually did it. But the first aspect of this worm, is that it used something you're very familiar with, ping. You know, it's echo request response protocol using ICMP to actually find systems that ultimately it would be trying to clean up. So think about that. It's like sending all this ping traffic out across the internet, saying, hey, let's take inventory, and then we'll go in and we'll see what's going on and blah, blah, blah. Well, as you might expect, the ping traffic went nuts and actually took out the internet. Now, let's think about that. To take out the internet is not an easy thing. I know even back in 2003, we had massive infrastructure. I mean, it's grown since then, but the idea that ping traffic would cascade speaks to the power of an internet worm. Now, here's what it was sort of like if you were working in an internet service provider or in a research organization or a university just collecting traffic. What you would see is if you're in an ops center, you probably are doing something called analytics. You've probably heard big data analytics as a term that's pretty frequently used, where in the analytics sense, you're monitoring stuff and being a little cynical, sometimes it's just counting and graphing. So a typical sort of thing you might be counting and graphing would be the amount of ICMP traffic that you might be seeing through all the different monitoring points that are part of your analysis work. So let's say you're a big university and you have a big cooperative amongst other universities and you're all collecting data and doing some sort of analytics. Then what you would have seen just before the Nachi worm is essentially very quiet pipes in terms of ICMP traffic, because that's not a big protocol. There's a lot of network management tools that use it, but it's not like HTTP or email or any of the things that really dominate the internet. So you would see very quiet traffic, and let's say on each hour you're refreshing and looking at the amount of traffic that comes in on different pipes. So at a particular time, and on the chart I sort of circle and show the gradual rise of the Nachi worm. In this section that I kind of circled that you see there on the chart where it's first evidence, let me give you an idea what it was like. Be imagining all these different pipes, and then in 1 hour change you might see one of the pipes increase just a little bit in terms of ping traffic. Now here's the challenge that you have with something like that. The question is, what do you do? Like, do you call someone? Do you not call someone? Do you mark it down? Do you keep track? Do you ignore it? What's the threshold? What's the driver that would actually make you take action? So let's say it's a little increase and you go, we'll leave it alone, we'll keep an eye on it. And then an hour later, it increases some more. And the question now is, has that increased sufficiently to take action? And furthermore, what action? Like, what are you going to do? Are you going to turn off ICMP, like make it impossible to ping either across your network or at least on that one gateway or whatever you're looking at? You see the point? It's very difficult, A, to determine when you should take action, and then B, difficult to figure out exactly what you do. Now, if you kept watching, what you would see is that in hour 3, 4, 5, maybe in the first 5 or 6 hours, it went from nothing to this massive explosion of ICMP traffic. And in fact, when this thing reached full strength, I almost can't believe I'm going to say the following metric, but blows my mind to this day. But for the latter portion of 2003, the Nazi worm, the traffic involved in the Nazi worm, ping garbage bouncing all over the place, accounted for, get this, up to 40% of the sessions on the public internet, where a session is a source-destination pair. You think of it as a flow. So that's mind-boggling. Like if you go back and you watch the kinds of things people were talking about on television in 2003, it certainly wasn't this. And unfortunately, those of us in the network community probably didn't make a big enough fuss about this, because I think that's a policy issue. I think it's part of the issue of internet governance and how we determine what threshold would cause the international community to do something, to maybe decide collectively that we're going to turn off ICMP traffic. And again, what does that mean? If you turn off ICMP traffic, that means at gateways, you're looking for ping or for that basic echo handshake. And if you see it, you drop it. You just don't allow it through. And that would have the effect of essentially dampening the worm propagation. But what does it break? As I said, network management tools frequently use that protocol to find equipment that needs update, to do network management, network monitoring. So the implications of taking action could be very consequential. So this Nazi worm was, I think, another learning point. We talked in a previous video about the slammer worm and how it helped us understand that there were indicators. The Nazi worm, I thought, taught us a few things. Number one, vigilante worms are a terrible idea. Number two, the idea that at what point do you actually do something? At what point, where do you set thresholds? Think about it in your personal life. If you're at home and someone is walking up your driveway, do you call the police? Now, depending on where you live, you might have different answers, but I'm guessing that the vast majority of you listening would not be calling the local police if somebody was walking up toward your home. Now, what if they're banging on the door, making a big commotion? Do you call the police at that point? Again, where is the threshold? Let's say they break a window and they climb in. Well, of course you would be calling the local police. The question is, have you waited too long? Is there consequence that's required before we spring to action? And back in 2003, the whole internet security community was grappling with these issues. So the good news is we were grappling. The bad news is here we are so many years later, and I can't tell you that we've completely solved the issue. I think we still have these residual problems of when there's indication and warning that an attack may be brewing, where's the threshold, and what sort of action would make sense in terms of doing something. Now, to sort of test our understanding here, we've got a very brief quiz, as we do on many of our videos. Now, as you consider the three, let's go through them. So firewalls, yeah, there's certainly some risk reduction. Probably not the primary means, but certainly a contributing factor. And you know, as we go through these quizzes, you know that there's generally not some absolute answer. Security is one of those things where, there's a lot of different things. If I said, what would be the best way to be healthy? And I said, one is jog, another one is eat better. Well, they both make sense. One might be better than the other. But so at any rate, firewalls help. The second one, patching, it turns out, has a significant impact on reducing worms, only because most worms find their way into your system by exploiting some sort of an unpatched vulnerability. So patching turns out to have a very strong effect, where firewalls certainly have an effect, but perhaps less so. And then third, encryption is probably not a significant risk reduction, because for the most part, traffic is going to just find its way across a network, whether it's encrypted, plaintext, ciphertext, sort of doesn't matter. So I would say probably the best answer would be to make sure that your systems are patched and to complement it with things such as firewalls. So I hope that helps your learning, and I hope this Nazi worm and its impact on the internet and on security is helpful to you. So we'll see you in the next video. Hi, in this video I want to talk to you about a construct, a hacking construct called a botnet. I'll bet a lot of you have heard of this, but I want to give you some background history and help you understand where this all comes from and what it means and how it plays. And I'll tell some stories and kind of give you a good feel for this. And we can see, and you'll see as we continue on, that botnets play such a significant role for the cyber offense. They've become kind of the offensive weapon of choice lately. So let's go back to 1999. So in 99, you may remember, and some of you may not remember, the Y2K event was going on, where we were worried that a lot of computers were going to break on the millennium change because of the date and so on and so forth. So there were a lot of projects going on all over the world trying to keep track of how things were going to turn out through the millennium change. So one of the things I worked on was a project here in the United States for the White House. So the White House was setting up a big center where we're going to collect all this data and keep track of what was coming and going in terms of the Y2K event. So we set that all up. And in the months prior to setting this thing up, I got invited to a meeting at Carnegie Mellon University. That's here in the United States in Pittsburgh. University has a great tradition in computer science and security. So they invited us to a meeting, and they told us about this thing that they called a zombie. I'll be honest with you, back in 1999, I really knew what a zombie was. I might have had a little bit of information I'd seen, but I didn't understand it totally. And here's what we were told. We were told that there were these pieces of code, malicious code that could be dropped on your machine, sort of like a remote access tool in reverse. You know how your computer has a remote access tool client to connect to a remote access server? Well, this would be the reverse, where a piece of software is dropped where someone out there can connect to your machine. So you're basically like a little mini server. And they said, and that, in a sense, makes you like a zombie, where someone can connect and then take control of your computer. And I thought, how's that going to work? I was kind of skeptical. I'd not really seen it in the wild. And they described it, and they said that there was this protocol, and maybe it would be using internet relay chat and other types of application level utilities for communicating between whoever was doing this and everyone's computer. And again, the emphasis was everyone's computer. And in those days, in business, for the most part, it would be a Windows computer. Today, maybe a little bit more heterogeneous distribution of Windows and Apple. But years ago, it was almost entirely Microsoft Windows in every business and a lot of homes as well. So they told us about the zombie thing, and here's some signature that you can go look for, meaning some file names and certain behaviors that you might see in the operating system. So I got back to, I was sort of working in a number of different labs at the time, and got back and looked, and saw them everywhere. Now I have to tell you, this is profound. Like when you don't see something, that doesn't mean it's not there. I think that's an important sort of lesson for anybody, not just in cybersecurity, but just in science, period. For example, I'm here in the studio filming, and if you told me, is, Radio Free Moscow here in the room with us, I would say, of course not, it makes no sense. And yet, if I had a radio and you could tune it and you flip it to the right sort of settings and it was sensitive enough, boom, there it is. You hear Radio Free Moscow. Now, does that mean it's here? Yes, it does mean that. And that's something as a scientist that you need to get used to. This idea that when you're staring at something, and in our case, because we're computer scientists, we're staring at networks and systems and computer applications and software and so on, just because we don't see something doesn't mean it's not there. So I went back and I looked and saw that the zombie code was there because I'd been given the information to tune to that setting, to set the sensitivity in such a manner you could actually see it was there. So it was a little frightening because you really came to grips with the idea that this stuff might be there. Now, what does this have to do with the Y2K Center? Well, the reason zombies were important is because they could play that reflection amplification game that I think we alluded to in an earlier video. The idea that my voice can go out one to many to all of you listening. And it works as long as you're able to hear my vocal cords make noise and it causes your eardrum to rattle a little bit. That's an amazing concept, one to many. Now, if I could make your eardrum reflect out, and let's say reflect to one of your friends, then my voice to all of your ears reflects and hits one target. That's a powerful concept because you can really build up a lot of traffic, a lot of volume that way. And furthermore, as I think we also alluded to in a previous video, amplification makes it even worse, meaning if I can not only hit all of your ears, but have your ears amplify what comes out. I say one thing and thousands of things come out of all of your ears from all of you at one target. So that's what we were worried about with these zombie, we're calling them zombie nets, now we call it a botnet. Back in 1999 for the Y2K Center. Now think about this. Y2K Center is one day, right? The millennium changes a day. So if everybody floods the Y2K Center for one day, you got a bit of a problem, right? Because we didn't know at the time how you would stop something like this. So that was sort of the first time I started thinking about how we would actually stop this. Now, if you're wondering how we did stop it, we didn't. It didn't happen. And I have to tell you, that's another profound concept that I want you to take from this. Listen, this is important. When an attack doesn't occur, you should not and should never confuse the fact that it didn't occur with your own cleverness, because you may have had absolutely nothing to do with it. And in the case of these attacks not happening, it's not because of any steps that we took to mitigate. We got lucky. A few months later, March of 2000, the first big denial of service attacks from zombies or botnets occurred, took out CNN and eBay and so on, Yahoo. So I remember feeling a little vindicated because I'd been running around getting everybody all spun up, including President Clinton at the time, got him very spun up that we were worried about this Y2K Center. But at any rate, what this has evolved to is a botnet. Now here are the components of a botnet. We've got a diagram here that shows sort of the geographic distribution of a botnet. First, it obviously includes bots. That's your computers, your mom's computer, your friend's computer, your boss's computer at work. Computers scattered across the entire planet Earth are all in band to bot insertion. Now, that's also profound. If you go back again, I keep sort of likening back to internet history. Back in the 1990s, a typical local area network in a business would be running a protocol other than IP. There was a company called Novell, still around, it had a protocol called IPX, it was part of a product called NetWare, blah, blah, blah. But it was different than IP. So you weren't in band. If a hacker's trying to hack a business, they'd hit a gateway where there's a different protocol. It'd be like driving your car up to the edge of a road, and now you have to be a boat to get any further. It was like that. Well, now we don't have that. Now everything's running IP. So the idea that you want to push bot software out to PCs, piece of cake, because everything's in band on IP, on TCP/IP. Has advantages, has disadvantages. And again, I hope you learn as you're going through these videos and going through the material that security is one of the consequences of all the interoperability and all the utility and fun that we have with the internet. Let's face it, the fact that we can do so much that's good allows us, unfortunately, to be able to do a lot of things that are sort of bad. So at any rate, so the first component, all these bots. The second would be these things called command and control elements. They're like the monitoring and management of a bot. And it's incredible how they do this, because it's this sort of like, think of it almost like a pass the token kind of scheme using the domain name system. And here's what I mean. Bots are programmed to go call back to their command and control. And it's done via addresses. And it says, you know, hey, go to this domain, and that's where you're going to get your instructions. But let's say that that command and control is knocked out. It's no longer available. Well, the resilience that's programmed into a botnet is using an interesting capability. I'm not going to get too much into it, but it's called fast flux DNS. And if you have some time, as additional learning, go off and Google it. Look up fast flux. You'll see how it works. But the bottom line is that it basically repoints and repurposes your call back to a command and control element that might have been knocked out to a different node. Can you imagine? The thing learns and reprograms and command and controls passed to other nodes. It's one of the most resilient structures we have in computer science. It's amazing. Like, I hate to use terms like elegant and well-designed and well-put around a piece of malware, but I don't know that you can use any other term. This is extremely elegant stuff. It's not written by little babies. These are not the kinds of malware designs that come, from somebody who just woke up yesterday figuring out how to do this. These are well-designed pieces of software, network management. So you have bots, you have botnet controllers, and then you have drop sites, and there's all those ancillary features. But in your own mind, it's the bots and it's command and control. And that has become the attack du jour. Now, sort of building on a theme I just alluded to, you know how we've been spending a lot of time talking about worms in previous videos? You might think, wow, how did we ever fix worms? Well, you know how we fixed it? The bad guys figured botnets are more powerful, so they stopped using worms. How's that sound? I mean, as much as I would like to say that it is our cleverness, because we did start notifying people when we saw worms propagating and telling everybody, there's packets on UDP, TCP, whatever. The reality is that it wasn't our cleverness that stopped these things. It's the fact that a better weapon came along. So you don't see worms so much because botnets are easier. How's that make you feel? Welcome to cybersecurity. So again, to summarize, botnets are the attack weapon of choice today for almost every cyber intruder, and also for people who are doing things non-security related, a lot of clicking, fraudulent clicking on links and so on to drive up ad revenue. You see a lot of that as well. But in our context, in the context of cybersecurity, offense, defense, botnets are certainly the attack weapon of choice. So in a subsequent video, we'll talk about doing maybe some of the arithmetic and math on how these things can potentially cause big problems. So I hope this has been helpful. We'll see you in the next video. Hi, today I'm going to spend some time with you on botnets and the impact a botnet can have on a target network. So it's a little bit of arithmetic that we'll go through to try to build up an understanding of the kind of consequence that you might see from a botnet that's aimed at some target for the purpose, presumably, of denial of service. I think that's, for the most part, the primary mechanism that we see today for denial of service. You could do it using other sorts of things, but think about it. If I can hit you with multiple sources of traffic versus one, probably makes sense to do multiple. Now, one thing as we think through the arithmetic that I want to make sure you keep in mind is that there are really a couple of different kinds of botnets. There's ones that are very happy to be honest about their source IP address, meaning from a server or whatever, I'm going to connect to a target and actually go through the three-step TCP handshake in order to establish a connection so I can really hit you with some traffic. So that's the first. The second would be a botnet where the individual bots are lying about their source IP address. So that way you can't attribute where the traffic's coming from. So I'm Alice, you're Bob, I whip a SYN packet at you, but I don't say that I'm Alice, I say that I'm George. Now what that means is that I'm not going to see the SYN ACK response, so I'm not going to be able to open a session, but I also hide myself. So in either case, there are pros and cons, right? But certainly in the first case, I can create a lot more traffic. If I establish a session with you, at the application level, I can ask you, download the stuff, I can throw traffic at you, I can do all kinds of really crazy things, versus in first case, or rather second case, where I'm hiding or spoofing the source IP address, I'm just throwing one SYN packet at you, something we would call a SYN flood. So let's assume that we're probably dealing with bots that are establishing a connection to a server for the purpose of really jacking things up. Now, if you go back to the 1990s, the kinds of connection that you would have to the internet would have been pretty bad, right? Just sort of learning how to connect to the internet. And we had this thing in telecom called a T1 connection. Maybe some of you may be familiar with that. It's a 1.5 meg connection, which today, I bet on your iPhone you get, the multiple times that. But at the time, that was a rockin' connection. Like a bunch of hippies here in the United States out in San Francisco would all go live in a hippie dorm and just live on top of each other, literally to get access to a shared T1 connection. Can you imagine? Well, think about that a minute. If talking about 1.5 meg, then the arithmetic we do as we build botnets and try and understand the lethality or the consequence of a botnet is to figure out how much traffic can I generate from one bot at a target, okay? So then if I have 10 of them, then I do 10 times that number, and that's the collective aggregate traffic being thrown at a target. Does that make sense? That's the methodology. So let's think about, now let's fast forward to the future to now, you know, where we all have broadband connections or connections, you know, at work or wherever you're connecting up to the internet. You might do it from a local public spot, a library, a school, wherever you're connecting. So your PC, the one you're using, if it has malware on it, bot software, then that bot software, if it wants to attack somebody, is going to be generating traffic outbound from your computer, right? Duh, that's how it would work. So the malware sits on your machine and it emanates traffic out. So would it be smart, if you're a designer, to generate so much traffic from the malware that it eats up your entire connection? Well, if you did do that, you generate a lot of traffic, but you're also going to get the owner of the PC pretty annoyed. They're going to notice that something is amiss, clearly. So that may not be the best thing to do. Might make more sense that if you know the size of the outbound connection, or if you can sort of posit the size of the outbound connection, let's say it's a 3 meg connection outbound. Not unreasonable to assume that. How about if you design the bot to just use a third of that? So it's not all of it, it's a third. So here's what it would mean to the user. The user would notice a PC that's a little sluggish. When you walk in the room, the PC is going like this. You know that noise? So if you do that, and you have an owner who maybe is reasonably permissive and accepting of a sluggish PC, like most of us, well, then you can get away with it for a long time. You might be able to leave that bot in place virtually indefinitely. You know, I'll tell you, my mother has a PC at home. When I walk in the house, it's, I hear the noise, it's sluggish. I say, Mom, what are you doing? You know, leave it alone. You know, it's fine. You know, not realizing that the bot software is probably attacking some country all day long. So the design concept is to use a portion of that outbound connection, and hopefully the botnet would be able to rely on that bot being somewhat persistent. So let's assume that you're stealing 1 meg outbound. So if you were, and you were targeting a T1 connection, then I really only need 1.5 computers with bots on them to be attacking. And then you can see in the chart, I have a list there of bots and outbound capacity and so on. If I was at 75, then 2 of them takes out a T1. Nobody has a T1 connection, so it's almost a silly arithmetic to do. But again, it gets us going. So let's continue on. So what if you have 10,000 of these things? And is 10,000 a large botnet? I would say no. In fact, I would say anything from 0 to 50,000 is considered somewhat pedestrian, where you wouldn't name it. You might keep track of it. But yeah, botnet of 50,000, that's not that big a deal. Talk to me when you get to 1 million. Then you've got a botnet that looks like it has some real consequence, like the ones you've read about, you know, the kinds of botnets that make their name known in, you know, in the magazines and so on. They're usually 1 million. But let's say you had 10,000. And at 10,000, I'm stealing 1 of the 3 meg outbound. Do the math. That's a lot of traffic. That's 10 gig. And I will tell you that the vast majority of you listening probably work for a company or go to a university or live in a town where there are buildings and companies and groups that are using 10 gig connections. In fact, it might be way less than that, depending on what country you're in. Here in the United States, very typical business connection to a data center, 10 gig. So what I'm saying is, just a reasonably pedestrian botnet of 10,000, really small, at 1 meg per bot, will take out a business. Now, that freaks me out a little bit, because you get bigger numbers. I have some listed there that I didn't want to get to. You have 1 million at a meg, and you really start talking about tearing down the fabric of the infrastructure. I've been worried about this for some time. And a few years ago, again here in the United States, I got invited to give a talk at the White House. And so I get there, and I'm giving a talk, and there's some big crowd there, and I noticed there's some pretty interesting looking people there, from like cabinet people, and I'm thinking, well, this is pretty interesting. So I get up and I was talking about what we're talking about right now, this concept of bot arithmetic and so on. And as I'm speaking, President Obama walks in. He walks into the room. I see Secret Service, making the little thing with their finger, meaning, hey, Ed, get off the podium. So I step back. President Obama walks over. I shake hands with him, and I sit down. And before I get to what he was talking about, I'll tell you, I was sitting right behind him. And right there on the screen, you can see a picture that I took. I needed proof, so I took a picture of the back of the president. And we'll make sure we have that for you on the video to look at. I needed proof that I actually met him, was talking. But the reason I bring it up is he got up and he started talking about this topic that we're talking about on the video right now. This topic. This is not, some theoretical issue. The President of the United States was concerned with the arithmetic that we're dealing with in terms of bot capacity and the type of damages that can be produced from a collection of bots on a botnet at a target. So this is somewhat unsolved. For those of you watching who may be thinking about graduate studies in computer security, maybe a PhD in computer security, this is a topic that you should be looking at. The ability to mitigate, to shape, to thwart, to block, to divert botnet traffic is an important consideration, particularly in the context of IoT devices, which number in the billions. So if you have billions of devices generating a bunch of traffic at a target, how are we going to stop this? And I will tell you that this is still an open question. So now, just to test our understanding here, like a brief little quiz question for you, just a little math. The answer is half as many as we talked about before. Before we said a 10,000 member botnet, I'd only need 5 if I double the capacity outbound on egress. So it gets even easier if you're willing to take up more of the egress connection. So again, I hope this discussion gives you a better feel for the threat of botnets, the kinds of capacity arithmetic that we all need to be concerned with as just citizens who rely on the internet every day for our personal and business use. So we'll see you on the next video. Hi everyone, I'm Ed Amoroso, and this week I'm standing with one of my good friends, Elad Yoren, who's the chairman of CoolSpan. Elad, thanks for joining us.
Ed, delighted to be here.
Yeah,
Thank you for the opportunity.
nice. Standing here in the lobby at NYU Tandon School, and hey, we want to learn about you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you kind of got interested in technology and ultimately into cybersecurity.
So first, I spent a couple of years at this very school, at this very building back before it was Tandon. So really wonderful to be back here with all of you guys. Back then it was Brooklyn Poly. So shout out to all the Poly folks.
That's great. So you came here. What were you studying at the school?
So I was working with one of the professors here who was doing some research in the area of infrastructure protection, bringing in sort of things we had done in the cyber world into the area of urban infrastructure protection. It was a very interesting 2 years.
Yeah. Now, you'd been in military school before that. Tell us a little bit
about
that.
School. So undergraduate degree at West Point, engineering, management, industrial engineering. So all the electrical engineering equations on that board behind me, kind of go way over my head at this point in time. I used to know them years ago. But West Point undergrad, and served as an Army officer, deployed, came back, graduate school, and got into cyber. It wasn't called cyber back then. We didn't have that sexy name.
Computer security.
It was computer security, network security, sometimes infosec. Infosec was about as cool as it got. But got into it because of the military aspect. Sort of had already been trained and to think in terms of perimeters and security and defense in depth and all those sort of concepts that we had been talking about for years, and applying into an area that I was just enjoyed, working in computers, hacking, playing with computers. Had my first computer in, at age of 12, and I guess sort of the rest, as they say, is history.
That's awesome. I'll bet during that time, you're probably working like the rest of us in sort of data security. But now you work in a very interesting area when you focused on voice and mobility and, people using smartphones to communicate. Tell us a little bit about the threat there. Like, should people be worried about voice security the way we've always worried about data?
So we started thinking about networks and data, and now it's voice, and it's kind of a privilege to be talking to you, sort of the guru of telco security and networks, and so we're now worried about voice,
right?
That's the oldest thing that people talk on their mobile devices. Just they used to be phones, you used to call them phones. Now they're smartphones, but the simplest thing you do is still make a phone call. Maybe the second simplest is send a text message,
right?
And we know because of internet working with different carriers around the world, not many, I'd say, are as sophisticated as AT&T, obviously, and you have carriers in different parts of the world that are much less sophisticated, much less advanced, internet working with ours and others around the world, and you create this environment that can be exploited by people, by foreign governments, by hackers. And so it's a big deal, and now it's an issue that's sort of rising up to the top of the awareness level, I think.
Tell me if I'm thinking about this right. So obviously data security is about a bunch of ones and zeros and data and email and files and things, but voice today is no longer analog, it's ones and zeros.
Voice is data.
So is it is that like as our community here thinks about that, is that like this merge of voice and almost any type of computing or communications, they're all converging on common technology. So the threats are probably converging too. Am I thinking about that right?
I think you're thinking about it absolutely the right way. I mean, remember, so voice used to be on one network and the data on a separate network. And now it's all integrated. So it's the same in our voice calls today are IP based. And so it's all one network. And so whether we're thinking about voice or data, I think the construct of sort of dealing with the issue is very similar.
You see a lot of business executives like worried as they travel and go to all kinds of crazy places and bringing their phone, being worried maybe about eavesdropping and other kinds of things going on.
So we've been thinking about this problem for a number of years. I'd say as recently as 2 years ago, people say, well, who'd want to listen to my phone calls? It was sort of security by obscurity, right?
Right.
I think today nobody thinks that. Everybody's aware that what they say is being intercepted and being monitored. And interestingly enough, in all of sort of my entrepreneurial experience in different areas of cyber, just the first time where, frankly, the market evolved first overseas. I think when we talk to our customers in South America, in Asia, in Europe, Middle East, they've been worried about this issue a lot longer than we have, and we're only catching up in the United States today. I think it's the issue of trust,
right?
That they have less of when it comes to their own government, certainly our government, and others in their communities, whether it's criminals, hackers, etc. I don't know if it's a good thing, but on the trust, there's an equilibrium that that's being reached. Either we're losing trust here, or somehow the equation's coming to an equilibrium for whatever reason. Yeah.
Our community will resonate because it's a very international group that's part of our learning community here. Now at CoolSpan, how do you solve it? I assume it's software encryption on the device.
So it's an over the top.
Over the top meaning services running on top of the underlying infrastructure, IP and delivery.
Correct. So it's an application that's installed on the handset. It can be downloaded from the Google Play Store or iTunes Store, or be provisioned by
onto my iPhone,
onto your iPhone, or onto your Samsung phone or other Android device, and then it, and most typically, so it's managed by your company's IT department or your IT or your company's security department. and then they will, and then, you know, to you as an employee of a company, it's just an app, and you make your phone calls, you make your text through that. You know, the one thing that we've been able to do that I think is unique or sort of certainly where the innovation takes place is the ability to encrypt a phone call and then boost the quality of the experience. So you've used encrypted phone calls as have I. Historically, it's always been, you know, tough experience, right? You use a phone call, you know what it's supposed to sound like.
Tinny, robotic.
Yeah, you go secure and has all the, you know, there's definite degradation there, but really interesting to be able to take a regular phone call, add all the security around it, and at the same time boost it to a higher quality.
That's awesome.
So I submit to you that, well, today people are using it because it's secure. They start using it because it's secure. They keep using it just because it sounds so much better. Not like I sound today, but generally speaking, it sounds so much better than a regular phone call. I say in a few years from now, or 4 or 5 years, 6 years from now, every phone call by default will be secure. I mean, why would you make a regular call when making a secure call is so much better?
No, I totally agree. Now, here in the U.S., have like government agencies kind of figured this out? Do you see sort of a trend toward, you know, more awareness reports coming out, things like that, that maybe point to mobility and mobility security?
Yeah, so it's been a long time coming, but the short answer is yes. I can point to 2 reports. One was published in March of 2017. The FCC working group published a set of recommendations around signaling system 7. And then more recently than that, in late April, Department of Homeland Security published what I think is really a wonderful report. They did a bang-up job addressing sort of a broad set of issues related to mobile security on the device side and on the network side.
And that's a great report. That DHS report really does lay out the whole framework and threat landscape and make some good recommendations around.
And there are tables in that report that just succinctly present, you know, what the issues are, technologies that are available to mitigate some of the risks, and they did a great job. It's a long report. It's over 100 pages, but worthwhile reading. That's homework assignment for you guys.
You know, are you surprised that we don't see voice conversations on WikiLeaks? Or maybe we have, but it seems like that may be sort of the next sort of big threat. You know, Lord knows I wouldn't want any of my voice conversations posted to the internet.
You know, it's
Is
really
that common?
I mean, how could it not be?
I know.
It's interesting. When we started our careers, you know, the advice we got from, you know, the then older and more experienced folks were, don't write it down, right? If you don't want people to discover it later on,
don't enter it into email.
Don't put it in email.
Right.
You know, pick up the phone and you know, keep it in the realm of voice because it's ephemeral. It'll be gone.
Right.
But to your question about WikiLeaks, you know, I don't think that advice necessarily is good advice anymore, because WikiLeaks could have voice recordings, text messages, just as easily as email.
Sort of profound, like that ephemeral or temporary nature of any kind of communication. You wonder if that even exists anymore. You know, it's just sort of like anything you do that involves electronics is going to be there maybe forever, right?
Either it'll be there forever, and or the metadata associated there. There's a whole separate conversation around metadata. But it's a big deal. It's becoming important. I think over the next year, 2, 3, we're going to be hearing an awful lot about the value of metadata, or the value or potentially the risks associated with it, depending on what side of the equation one's on. But,
well, I appreciate everything
so
you do at
not going away.
No, I'm glad you do what you do at CoolSpan, helping us keep voice communications safe. I hope our whole community goes and takes a look at CoolSpan, and you'll learn a little bit more about the product there, and learn about maybe how they might use the tool.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Great. Well,
he's the legend. Thank you for the opportunity to come in and chat with you.
That's great. Thanks. On behalf of the whole group, I appreciate your time.
No, delighted to do it. Ed.
Thanks, man. We'll see you. Hi, Ed Amoroso here, and for this video, I want to spend some time talking to you about assets. So an asset is something of value. So in your personal life,
Your money, your belongings, your home, your family, these are all assets. In fact, there's also sort of intangible assets like your reputation, your personality. These are things that, certainly we would consider part of our personal asset base. But in computer security, we're going to spend time thinking about assets. Here's the reason. If you're hacking someone, if you're doing cyber offense, I think you would agree that it makes more sense to go after something that a target values than to go after something that they don't value. Does that make sense to you? So, for example, I remember I had a friend had this dumb bird cage with a bird in it, and I remember it was like when I was in college, and everybody just wanted to just get rid of this bird. It was noisy and so on. So if somebody had come along and swiped the cage and the bird and left with it, that's hardly a hack. That's certainly not a consequential hack for me. That you're doing us a favor. You get the point, and it's a whimsical, kind of silly example. But I think you want to keep that in mind. We can get kind of lost in the technology here very easily and think about protocols and firewalls and crypto and all this stuff that we'll be doing through the videos as we go through this and as you study cybersecurity, and completely forget that the whole point of this from an offensive perspective is go after something you care about. That's the reason you do it. That's a successful hack is something that involves consequence to an asset. Now, how do you figure out what your assets are, and how do you figure out how to prioritize them? So let's go through another one of Ed Amoroso's dopey analogies here, but I think it'll help you. Imagine a whimsical example. Imagine you're near your apartment, your home, your dorm, whatever, and I tell you, you've got 1 minute to run into your house or dorm or apartment and grab everything that's important to you and then get out. And then we're going to flip a coin, and if it's heads, you get a chance to go back. If it's tails, then that's it. You don't ever get to go grab your stuff. You just keep what you got the first round. So you go, what? And so, all right, okay. So are you ready? And I go, go. So you run in the house. What are you going to grab? Are you going to grab money? Well, maybe. Might make sense. Are you going to grab family heirlooms? Yeah. Would you grab the newspaper on the table? No. Would you grab a television? Maybe. Your phone? You get the point? You go through in your mind a decision process around the value of an asset. And one of the attributes that I think is pretty important in determining value is replaceability. What that means is if a particular asset is just trivially replaced, I mentioned the newspaper, why would you grab that? Why would you waste 1 millisecond picking that up? You want to grab things that are not easily replaceable. Now, some just simply can't be replaced. In your personal life, I mentioned family heirlooms. If there's some old pictures of your grandparents or people that are very meaningful to you, you're going to run right to that and grab it because they can't be replaced. If there's money can be replaced, but maybe not that easily. So you might grab that. Do you get the point? I want you to think through in your mind this question of how do you value assets? How do you determine what's valuable, what's not? Now, let's say you get out of your home and we flip the coin and you win. You're able to go back one more time. So now that you've taken the first tier, highest priority assets, you've set them aside. Now you get to go in and now you have a second shot at it. And in terms of prioritization, you're going to find that the second time in, you'll be a little bit more permissive about what you take and what you don't because you've already taken the most important things. Now, what's the second most important thing? And if you kept going successively through iterations on the set of assets you've got in computing, it would be in your infrastructure, you have a pretty good idea. Now, I know that's hardly engineering, right? I mean, it seems so informal. But the reality is that this is the way we do it in cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a relatively new discipline. Let's face it, we've probably traced our origins to the mid-1980s. That's not that long ago. We're still sort of figuring out how to do this. But if you and I are together, and it's our task to walk, say, into a data center and figure out what are the key assets in here. Well, how do we do it? I think you think about it the same way as running into your apartment. You think, all right, let's go in, and what items, if taken or replaced or destroyed or compromised, would create great havoc. And that's a sort of a definition that a lot of people use for critical assets, or in the context of the society, services that society depends on, critical infrastructure. So the idea of figuring out what's essential, what's high priority, what's critical, is not some process that we can assign quantitative values to, but rather tends to be very qualitative, and the judgment and experience of the person making that determination really plays a significant role in how you would actually do it. So let's say you walk in a data center. How do you determine the assets? Well, a lot of times it sort of plays into three categories. Not always, but a lot of times it's sort of three categories, where category one would be sort of like hardware, tangible physical pieces of equipment, means less in the context of virtualization, certainly, but certainly still equipment. Second would be kind of software, like the infrastructure code that powers the way things operate, and increasingly with cloud services and virtualization, that we see a balance tipping more towards software in our society and our infrastructure and in the data center than hardware. Used to be the other way, like 20, 30 years ago, a lot of hardware, a little bit of software. Now it's a lot of software, a little bit of hardware. Nevertheless, those would be the first couple. And then all the information and your product and whatever you would consider, in some sense, your intellectual property, the things that are of value, say, to a business in a data center, customer records, let's say your software company, the code you write, any design documentation, any email correspondence, all that kind of stuff, your financials. These are the assets that you think through and make some determination in terms of priority around. And I'll tell you, I wish I could tell you that there was just a button you push and the answer pops out where the prioritization is driven by something that you can automate. We can't do that now. It doesn't work that way. You actually have to have some judgment that you use. And we'll go through some exercises in subsequent videos where I'll help you do that. Now, a lot of you might be wondering at this point, sort of in our discussions, when are we getting to crypto? When are we getting to firewalls? When are we getting to the real technology? That's coming. But I think the difference between someone who's been properly grounded in cybersecurity and somebody who's not is that you have to think these things through. You have to have a good understanding of assets and prioritization and so on to really make sense of how you put technology to practical use. So I hope you keep that in mind. I know a lot of you are very eager to jump in and start doing some real hardcore technology, and we'll get there. But I do want you to have these background foundational concepts in mind as we go further with the material. So I hope this has been useful, and we'll see you on the next video. Hi folks, Ed here. Today we're going to talk about risk. Now, in your personal life, the concept of risk is this informal thing that we assign sort of just an informal semantics to or definition. Like you would say, it's risky to do this thing, or it might be, don't do that, that's a very high risk. Like we do it sort of informally. But in cybersecurity, we're actually going to use the term risk in a more quantitative way. So we're going to use it as a defined term that has some real meaning, mostly focused on the probability and consequence associated with attacks. So let's use a couple of simple examples. I always use these whimsical examples outside of computing, and then we'll bring it back to computing. But imagine that you're driving in a car, and it's you alone in the car. You're driving along, and I say, I would like to calculate the risk associated with you maybe getting into some sort of a serious crash. So you would say, well, there's two dimensions to that. One is, how likely is it that I would get into a crash? And then second, if I get into a crash, what ultimately is the consequence of that? So it's those two dimensions, probability and consequence, that feed this. Does that make sense? So again, when we talk about computing, we're going to be focused more on networks and virtualization software and so on. But it doesn't hurt to think about a car and you driving in it. So now, let's imagine that I'm in a car and suddenly the road becomes very slippery. Temperature drops, there's precipitation, it freezes, and I'm on an icy road. So the first question is, has the probability that I may get into an attack, into a crash, has that increased? Well, yes, of course it does. It's a slippery road. Now, the consequence still is me. Some bad thing could happen to me or whatever's in the car with me. Let's say I have nothing of any value in the car, it's just me. Well, the consequence, whether I'm in a safe car or whether I'm in an icy road, is the same. So we'd say the risk is increased because it's an icy road, but really it's just me in the car still. So that's the first case. Second possibility, let's say you're driving in the car and nothing changes about the road, the traffic, the weather, the car, nothing. You're not distracted, you're driving. But now imagine that there's a little baby in the back seat, in a car seat. Are the consequences a little different now of a car crash? You bet they are. Right now, it's not just you, but you're bringing a little baby along. And if you get in an accident, then the first question anybody's going to ask is the baby okay? Don't ask about you. It's because the consequences increase. Do you follow? So there's really two ways that risk can be affected by some change in a system. And risk is inherently something that's measured based on change. And we'll get to that in a minute. But let's think about this. The first thing is the probability of an attack in terms of cybersecurity can increase, or the consequence of the attack can increase. So for example, a system that's put in place that has customer records on it. Let's say it's 1,000 customer records. And I put it on a system and it sits behind a gateway that's not connected to the internet and it's just private and there's X amount of risk. I don't want my customer records exposed, but it's on a network that's private. I think we're good. You'd measure that risk as some number. Now, it's tricky because you'd say, what number? Like, is there some universal scale that we all use? And, we have unity risk at 0. It's not like that. What happens instead is that you pick some numeric scale. Sort of like the stock market, where there's a number. You buy a stock at a number. Does it matter how much that stock costs when you buy it? No. But it matters whether it goes up or down. And risk is like that as well. So what we would do is something called baselining. Do that a lot in system security engineering, where you baseline a number. And you come up with some reasonable sensitivity in terms of probability and consequence, and you just say, this is my baseline unit risk at some point in time. Does that make sense? So you baseline something. Now, let's say you decide in this little local area network with 1,000 customer records on a server that you're going to connect to the internet. You get your first internet connection, and now people from the internet, can come in and, do maintenance on your server or whatever reason you would be connecting. Well, guess what? The probability of attack has now gone way up. Have the consequence changed? No, it's the same stuff. Your customers would be just as angry if you lost the data. That hasn't changed. But the probability that something could happen has gone way up because you're connected to the internet. Now let's unravel. Let's go back to the case where it's still a private network with no internet connection. I've got 1,000 customer records. And you suddenly realize, well, 1,000 is just a small percentage of our customers. Let's put all of them on. Let's put 1,000,000 customer records on that server. How are you feeling about risk now? It's gone way up because you have more consequential assets on that server. So there's these two ways that risk can be affected. Now, every one of you right now are thinking the correct question, and that's, well, what if one goes up and one goes down, right? Like, what if I went from 100 customer records to 10 at the same time that I connected to the internet? Welcome to security risk management. And you can see how that's a very subjective judgment that you'd have to make. The discomfort that anybody doing cybersecurity has, particularly in a practical setting, is how informal a lot of this is. As an academic, particularly somebody who's always giving exams and helping students, work out answers to questions and to problems, you always look for things that are quantitative, where there's a number and they can't really argue with you one way or another. But cybersecurity doesn't work like that in practice. I wish it did, but it just doesn't. In practice, judgment, qualitative versus quantitative judgment, and that question of, well, this This one went down, the consequence went down, the probability went up. Did they balance? Has the risk stayed the same? Did this drop more than this increased? You follow? It's very difficult to kind of go through that. And that's where experience and just having the willingness to try to make good decisions, good management decisions about cybersecurity may be the most important factor here. So just in terms of sort of your additional learning here, try and think about some scenarios in your own mind, say in your own personal life, where the increase in probability of something might increase your risk, or where increase in consequence might increase risk. Think that through. I'm sure in your own life, maybe even in the context of things you do, either at work or school that might be technically related. What decisions might one make that increase risk, and correspondingly, what sort of decisions might be made that could decrease risk? That'll be a good thought exercise for you as you think about this lecture and as you continue to advance in your understanding of risk management in cybersecurity. So we'll see you on the next video. Hi folks, Ed here. We're going to spend some time now focusing on management decisions that you make around cybersecurity. That might sound like kind of the supervisory sort of thing, but not really. You know, even if you're embedded in technical and architectural activity, you know, where you're doing a little more gearhead work, you're going to be making decisions about what's appropriate given a threat that may exist or not exist for a given asset. So it turns out there's two primary factors that we take into account when we're making security management decisions. The first is clearly the effect on risk, like is it increasing security? If I put a big massive wall in front of something, then there's a good chance that that's going to be increasing security. But the second factor has to do with cost. And I use cost not necessarily in a financial sense, but more what's the impact? What's the overall impact in terms of usability? Certainly in terms of money and so on. So you can think of it as sort of the security versus the, you know, what you're investing. You know, am I spending a lot? Am I getting a lot of security? So let's think this through. So there's a classic chart that you can see on the screen there that shows X and Y grid. And it shows the decisions from some point. So for example, if your system exists in some state and you make a decision to improve security, to increase security, well, there's a couple of different options that might be true with respect to cost. One is increased security costs you money. Right? You say, I'm going to buy a firewall, costs you money. You have to spend money. And that's a normal case. It's something that most of us are very comfortable with. You want more security, spend more money. Not a big deal. But there's another case that's a lot more interesting, and that's where increasing security potentially can decrease your cost. And I think most of you who have backgrounds in engineering or development know that it's cheaper to do something right than to do it wrong, which means if you take the time to build code properly, for example, or design a system properly, or prevent attacks right up front, then it's more secure and saves you money. Like that's sort of the whole idea. If you had to, in a nutshell, kind of encapsulate what security management is all about, it's that. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, there are certainly cases, you see in practice, see it all the time, where somebody is, you know, either increasing, decreasing security, whatever, and increasing costs. Like the worst case of all is that I decrease security, increase cost. Not a good idea. But you can think of a lot of cases where that may be true, where you're, you know, maybe introducing something like that creates a false sense of security, for example, like you're putting something in place that's very expensive, it's a big tool, it makes everybody think that you're nice and safe, but you're actually not, because you may be taking your eye off the ball on where the real threat is, because you've spent all this money on this, you know, whatever was functional or procedural mechanism that you were hoping would reduce cost. So I think as we sort of work through this methodology for making decisions in terms of security and cost, I want you to keep that sort of in mind, that the optimal situation is always to try to improve security and decrease cost. And the scenario that you want to avoid in all of your work activities, engineering or otherwise, is the scenario where you are decreasing decreasing security and increasing cost. Yeah, it's really the scenario that you want to keep out of any use cases that you're involved in. So now to kind of test our understanding here, let's think through a very simple little quiz. Let's start with authentication. Clearly, if I prove authentication for insiders, they're still insiders. So it's not going to have much impact at all on insiders. If everybody who's already inside just gets a stronger form of, getting into the building or getting into systems, they're still there. So that's an example of spending money and not reducing the risk at all. So that would be a very bad decision. It might be good for other things. You might want to improve authentication to keep outsiders from your system, but if insiders you're concerned, that's not the solution. Logging certainly does reduce risk. I think in the presence of surveillance, insiders are going to be a lot more careful about the kinds of things that they're doing. And then finally, increasing penalties probably does reduce the risk somewhat. But my personal style as an engineer is I'd rather be introducing a functional mechanism. But later on, as we start learning about safeguards and countermeasures, you're going to find that there's not just functional mechanisms that come from the world of computing and networking, but there are also ones that involve things like penalties. Sometimes those are very useful. So I hope that little quiz helps with your learning, and we will see you in the next video. Hi folks. For this video I want to talk to you about something called a threat tree. Now, here's the motivation behind this. If I were to ask you to tell me what you think the security issues are in some system, let's say we're walking in a data center together. You're first day on the job, you're the security expert, and I want you to look at the data center and list out what you think all the issues are. That's a pretty typical sort of request that you might get. A lot of you, I'm sure, are kind of mulling over the possibility of a career in cybersecurity. I would say there's probably a 50-50 shot that if you go into cyber, at some point, you're going to be dragged into some situation and someone's going to say, hey, what are the security issues here? You're the expert. Tell me. It happens all the time. What generally follows is a process that I call structured brainstorming. That's where you and a colleague, you go, hey, well, maybe there's a problem over here and problem over there and what else? Problem over here. And then as time progresses, you start running out of things that you can find. So you have problem, then another problem. Then you can't think of any more. So you say, this is what we found. And it's this brainstorming that, in my mind, gives a lot of security assessments a bad reputation. Here's why. You have no idea if you got them all, right? You don't know if you did. If you had 3 other smart people with you, then maybe you find more. So how does that methodology find issues? And again, issues might be vulnerabilities, places for fix. You get the point. Just this idea of trying in an unstructured way to come up with these brainstormed ideas of what you think the security issues are around a system. That's a terrible way to do the engineering. It's not something that you see in any other branch of engineering. Other branches, you're building models, you're using quantitative methods to derive things. You don't build a bridge by brainstorming. It just doesn't work that way. So a technique that security engineers have come up with that's admittedly not perfect, but it improves that structured brainstorming process somewhat. Here's the technique. The technique is called the threat tree, where what we try to do is categorize issues in a complete or provably complete manner for as many hierarchical decompositions as is possible. So for example, if we were looking for potential threats to a system, would you agree, and you probably do because I'm sure you saw in an earlier video, we introduced the CIA model. So would you agree that if I said all possible threats are either confidentiality, integrity, availability, with the caveat, of course, that we said that in some cases fraud, set aside fraud. Let's use the CIA model. We could say the first level of our threat tree is that the issues are either going to be confidentiality, integrity, or denial of service. Now, if I can make that claim, then I can posit that that's complete, right? I've got a complete understanding that they fall into 3 categories. Isn't that cool? Now, if I could do it again, if you say, for each of those three, I could say potentially that if my assets are, say, hardware, software, and information, well then I've got three possibilities for the first three possibilities. So it's either confidentiality of hardware, software info, or it's integrity of hardware, software info, or it's denial of service to hardware, software info. And now I've got 9 categories of things that are much more specific, right? It's not this broad, hey, what are the threats? And everybody brainstorms. Now I've got some guidance. I can take it another level. Like let's say I say, maybe I'm looking for problems that involve insiders, outsiders, or combined. So now I've got 9 leaf nodes with 3 possibilities. I now have 27 categories of things that guide me through a more structured process, like integrity threats to hardware by insiders. Oh, okay. Now I can do structured brainstorming on that. And maybe I can take it 10 levels deep, and I maybe have 1,000 nodes that I'm actually looking at. You decide, you're the engineer, and you figure out what makes sense. This is an improved way of trying to make sense of cybersecurity issues. Look, cybersecurity is about lists and groups and sets and categories. That's what it's about. It's about coming up with a set of potential problems and then having solutions to those problems. That's what we do all the time. I'm sure a lot of you who maybe have dabbled a little bit in cyber hacking and so on and so forth, you understand the power of keeping track of vulnerabilities, of tracking lists and having categories of vulnerabilities and knowing what the different attributes are, what systems they apply to and how long they've been in place and which patches apply. It's a very taxonomy-oriented kind of discipline, this business of doing cybersecurity in a practical setting. So you can see how a threat tree can provide some hierarchical ordering and some structure through that decomposition to maintaining completeness as we try and keep track of issues on a system. So think through that process, maybe for sort of additional thinking as you go off and ponder this lecture. Try to think through how you might categorize virtually anything in your life in terms of a stepwise decomposition where you maintain completeness as long as you possibly can, and then you can do some sort of brainstorming at the bottom. So I hope this has been a helpful introduction to one of the tools that we find very useful in doing system security engineering. Thanks. Hi everyone, Ed Amoroso here, and I want to welcome you to this module. And our goal in this module is to help you learn a pretty important technique in cybersecurity defense, which is mapping assets to threats, kind of understanding that intersection between problems that occur on the internet and maybe some ways that we can deal with building a defense, sort of starting to think about how we can reduce risk. And there's some papers and materials that I think would be very useful to you as we go through this module. So first off, there's a couple of papers that I want to point out. One is called Man-in-the-Middle Attack on UMTS. UMTS is a type of wireless technology. You'll learn about it in the paper, written by Meyer and Wetzel. Suzanne Wetzel is an old friend of mine, a colleague at the Stevens Institute of Technology. Very, very cool paper about how you can, in some sense, eavesdrop on wireless. I think you'll enjoy it. And the second is from one of the grand masters in cybersecurity, Gene Spafford. We all call him Spaff. And his paper is called Are Computer Hacker Break-ins Ethical? It's good paper, and you'll see some of Spaff's personality come out through that. He's a professor at Purdue University. Now, there's a couple of optional books that I think would be useful for you to consider using as you go through the module. One is an ebook that I wrote with my son Matt. It's called From CIA to APT, An Introduction to Cybersecurity. Kind of a companion ebook to the course. Again, optional, but for some of you, you might want to go on Amazon and download it, because some people like to have a little book that they can read along with as the lectures progress, as you go through this module and you look at the different videos that we've been covering. Now, a second book that you may consider is a TCP/IP book, and my favorite is by Richard Stevens. And you really ought to have a good, solid TCP/IP textbook, I think, on your shelf. If you want to do this for a living, certainly you're going to have to know TCP/IP in the way that a chemist knows the periodic table. So if you decide that such a book makes sense, chapters 7 and 8 in Stevens' book would be good ones to go through as we go through this module. So I hope you'll do that. A couple of TED Talks that I think you ought to look at. One is from a former colleague of mine at AT&T, Lori Faith Craner. She gave a nice talk called "What's Wrong with Your Password?" And I think you'll enjoy Lori's very infectious personality. She's got a lot of enthusiasm. She's very, very capable, and I think you should hear her talk. So I list that. And then Mikko Hyppinen from F-Secure, one of the great minds in cybersecurity. Is a video called "Fighting Viruses, Defending the Net." I think you should take a look at it. Hopefully all of these resources will complement your learning in this module, and I hope you take advantage of all of them. So enjoy. Hi folks, this is Ed. I want to start this video with a little bit of career discussion. I think it'll be useful for you. I'm going to guess that more than half of you who are watching this are considering careers in cybersecurity. And it probably makes sense for me to give you a little bit of advice as we go into this topic, which is really mapping assets and threats together. I want to show you the topic, but I want to show it to you in the context of something called security consulting. It's a growth field. It's something that when you have some skill, you can very easily do either on your own or do in the context of a large company or do as a consultant for any number of different industrial concerns, whether they be consulting firms, accounting firms, tech firms, and so on. So the idea is that there's this burgeoning industry where experts will be hired by companies to take a look at their situation, their network, their data centers, their applications, their software, whatever, and provide back to them something that's referred to as posture. For me, posture means am I standing up straight, but in the context of cyber, posture means what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses, and what should I be doing about any gaps between the weakness and where I need to be. That's the idea. So an expert comes in, looks at and assesses posture, and makes recommendations. I'm going to guess for a lot of you, frankly, if you work through these videos and work through the material we've been helping you with, you probably have as much skill as a good percentage of the consultants that are out there today. But I would urge you that if you have some interest in that, then the two worlds that come together to be a good consultant are the world of understanding cybersecurity. Obviously, you really do need to be an expert, but also the business skill of being able to interact and communicate and speak and write. These are things that are very important. So my heartfelt advice to you as we go through this threat asset matrix approach, and we'll go through in several videos how we use this in the context of assessing a system. I'll take you through some case studies. But I want you to recognize that if this is something you like, as you're going through this, you say, I enjoy that. I think it's fun to assess a system, determine what sort of weaknesses are there, make recommendations about fixes, then I think you should make sure that you're sort of complementing your tech skill with communication skill. Anytime you have the opportunity to give a talk, to write something, to present at a meeting, to be sort of teaching, whatever you can do that allows you to improve your communication skills, please do that. I think that's something that you're going to find will be a big differentiator as you build your career. Hopefully, I'm a little biased, but I hope you go into cybersecurity. Now, let's talk about the technique. It's called threat asset matrices and threat asset mapping. There's a lot of different ways of referring to it, but it's at the base of all security assessments. It's at the base. And what it starts with is an identification first of all your different asset types in whatever it is you're doing some sort of an evaluation for. We'd said in some previous videos that the three categories are often hardware, software, information. For now, we'll use that. But you'll see as we do a case study later. You can break it up into anything. In your home, the assets might be my garage, my house, my basement, my backyard. There's 5 things that you'd name, or whatever. You want it to be very specific to the setting, but just in a generic sense, we can say hardware, software, information for now. But the key point is it's a finite set. It can be determined to have completeness. Now, within each category, maybe there's an infinity of different possibilities in terms of groupings and how you think through what the asset values are. But the reality is you really can make a finite set of assets. So let's start with that. Now, we've said repeatedly that if we're willing to buy into the CIA model, then all threats fall into those 3 categories: confidentiality, integrity, denial of service. That's kind of cool, right? If you have a finite set of assets and a finite set of threats, the cross product produces a workable matrix. That's really good news, because you're going to see later there's all kinds of infinite sets that pop up. Like if I said, what are all the vulnerabilities in some operating system like Linux? Good luck. That's probably not going to be an easily attainable finite set. But in this case, mapping threats and assets, we can build a workable matrix. It's finite, that has cells that we can look at. So for example, 3 by 3, we've got a chart that's showing on the screen here that shows the 3 asset types and the 3 threat types cross product. And you can look at each one, like confidentiality of hardware. What is that? That means, am I concerned that a hacker knows what my hardware is? Maybe you are concerned, maybe you're not. Usually that's pretty low. But how about integrity of your information? Like that's pretty important. Or confidentiality of your information. That's a huge security concern in most cases. So you can see how this structure provides a baseline foundational view of the kinds of things that we're going to be building on as we do security assessments. Now in subsequent videos, we are going to dig into this a little bit. But for now, let's just do a little quiz to test our knowledge. Obviously, your reputation is an asset, but we tend in cybersecurity not to include it as a tangible asset, only because I can't really attack your reputation. I can attack your system. I can attack what you say, in terms of your communication, and that might have impact on your reputation. Like I can't attack your mood as a person. I can attack you, they can put you in a really bad mood. But generally, we wouldn't consider that an asset in a threat asset matrix. Cash in the bank, ditto. Now, granted, the value itself, the balance value is a big issue. There's no question. So certainly the integrity of your financial records is important, but we wouldn't so much think of the cash. But then obviously servers is clearly an asset that we would be focused on. So I just want to get you thinking that these are the kinds of things that we'll be looking at as we do threat asset matrices and as we work through some case studies. So we'll see you in the next video. Hi folks, Ed here. Now, in a previous video, we went through and introduced the concept of threat asset matrix. And I just want to spend a few minutes here as kind of a bridge to doing some examples with you to just remind you that as we do a threat asset matrix, each of the individual cells in the matrix corresponds to a risk assessment. Does that make sense? So as we look at a cell, as I look at a pairing between an asset like your hardware and a threat like confidentiality, and I come to some determination that perhaps the cross product is low risk. Well, where did that come from? How did I determine that something is low risk? Now, we've talked earlier about a couple of different techniques, one of them being threat trees. So a possibility might be taking that cross product, hardware, confidentiality, and taking that down, looking at insiders, outsiders, and combined, whether it involves an automated attack or a manual attack or combined, and you take that down. It may be that you decide as the engineer that you want to do a threat tree for each of the cells in an threat asset matrix. Isn't that interesting? Like each cell is itself a risk management activity. That's pretty profound, because the way I want you to think about these things, the way I want you to think about security engineering in general, is that as we identify different types or categories of issues that we're going to be working through, each of those categories, each cell in a threat asset matrix, is itself a little mini project, okay? That's something that I think is hard for engineers, developers, hackers to understand. A lot of times you think, what does a manager do? You know, managers, it just seems like all they do is sit around and watch us work. But the essence of management is providing structure around work activity. So the way to think about a threat asset matrix is that it organizes the work activity that allows us to characterize both quantitatively and qualitatively the risk associated with some threat asset pair that resides as a cell in our matrix. Now, that's a big mouthful of words, but what it comes down to is that in a threat asset matrix, it's a mapping of work. So you can see, you know, we're showing a chart here that shows the low risk for hardware and confidentiality. Makes good sense. But what about software and integrity, right? Well, if we did the math, if we did the analysis, did the risk management activity, we would come to the conclusion that in most scenarios, the idea that the software in your infrastructure might have malware, might have bot software embedded, might have Trojan horses, could have trapdoors, different types of integrity problems, that's usually really serious. That's something that in most environments, think about a bank, for example. It's the last thing that you could possibly tolerate. There cannot be that problem. So you can see how confidentiality of your hardware, you know, important, but all right, so you know that I'm running this type of processor with this type of OS. I understand that hackers want to know that. I get that. I'm not saying anything zero risk. But that risk versus malware embedded in the system software, you can see the difference. Does that make sense? It's important because as we get deeper into all of this, and as I sort of step away from the management issues as we get further along and dig into some technology, I want you to keep that in mind. I think it's been a technique that I've used for many years. I've been teaching cybersecurity now for almost 30 years. And I find that a lot of my students over the years always want to dive immediately into cryptography, immediately into the fun technical detail, and I always slow them down, time out, and try and force a thought process where you're understanding that foundationally is all about risk management. And you might decide, for example, that the difference between putting cryptography in a system or taping a sign on top of a server and saying, do not touch this, may be minimal. You may remember from an earlier video, we talked about a soda machine that we were breaking into and came to the conclusion that maybe taping a sign on the soda machine was just as effective as putting some functional mechanism or hanging a camera. So it's an interesting sort of discipline, this cybersecurity. It's something that requires a little bit of management skill, a little bit of technical skill, but in the context of threat asset matrices, I want you to think of each cell as a risk management activity. Now what we're going to do, we're going to jump into another video. I hope you'll go right on to the next one because we're going to start into a case study where we go through a real network, do a real analysis, and come up with some practical recommendations for what they may do. So I'll see you in the next video. Hi folks, Ed here. Now we're going to have some fun in this video. We're actually going to decompose the assets in a real system. But I want to start with a little story. A number of years ago, I remember being called in to visit with a federal government agency here in the United States. They were having some security issues and were wondering whether certain types of functional mechanisms should be put in place. It might have been crypto or firewall, something that they were proposing to do. When I got there, the first question I had was, what is your network? You know, what does it look like? Do you have a diagram? Do you have a picture? You have something? And you could hear crickets. Like there was no diagram. There was no inventory. There was no understanding of what it is that they were working with. Now, this is a unique problem that we have in computing. Look, I'll bet some of you have, say, architects or building engineers or construction engineers in your family. And you know that you don't build a building until there's a blueprint, right? And the blueprint probably lays out the structural design, the plumbing design, the electrical design, all kinds of different things. All these systems and structure are diagrammed in a very standard way that the architect knows, the builder knows, the homeowner knows. Everybody can read the quote-unquote plans. Do you have plans for your business? I know a lot of you don't have a business. Maybe a lot of you don't work in a business, but for those of you who do, or if you're familiar with anything like your school or even your home, do you have any idea what your setup is? Is it written down somewhere? Certainly no standard way of doing that. And that is a crippling problem that we have in computing. It is absolutely crippling. Think about this. If you're studying chemistry, you put a periodic table up, everybody learns that, and when you're balancing equations, you're doing the same thing using the same notation that somebody halfway around the world is using at the same time. There's a standard way to do it. It's agreed upon, it is common, and we can interchange ideas using a framework that we'll all understand. Now, superimposed to two computer science majors in college, say, and one is given an assignment to design a network to do such and such. Halfway around the world, the same student given the same assignment, are they writing down the same thing? No, they don't. They start from who knows where. This one draws this kind of thing. This one doesn't even do any drawing. We are crippled in computing by the fact that we're such a new discipline. Computer science has been around since the 1960s, more or less. We've had about 50 or 60 years to progress. Whereas everything else, engineering, chemistry, math, they've all had thousands of years to progress. So we're way behind. And one of the things we don't have is a common notation. Now, I'm going to show you kind of a little diagram that we'll use to decompose a typical company system, network, enterprise. But in your case, you may decide you want to do some other sort of diagram. I'd mentioned in an earlier video about a career in security consulting. Half the job of the security consultant is just helping a customer understand what they have. Just doing an inventory is maybe even more than half the problem for many companies. Like I said, this government agency that I'd gone down and visited, they had no diagram. And when we actually built one, when we interviewed the people and tried to figure out what the diagram was, it was obvious that they had a real network, they had a test network, they were both connected together. One had a firewall to the internet, one was directly connected to the internet. Ta-da! That's why they had problems. It's because nobody had taken the time to diagram their network. So we're going to do a little multi-part case study now. I want to introduce the components of the case study network here. And you'll recall in a threat asset matrix, we keep track of what the different assets are. Before we said hardware, software information, we're not going to do that now. Now we're going to be a little more specific about what we think the assets are. So I'm going to pop up a picture here of a typical little company. And you can see that the assets that we've got there, we've got mobiles, certainly one category. So we'll assume everybody's got a mobile device. Second, we'll assume everybody's got a PC. So that's a second category of asset. Third, they all sit on some enterprise local area network, probably Wi-Fi. In the old days, this was a big deal. The corporate enterprise was one of the most important assets. Now, not so much. Now it's more about cloud, a little less about what exists locally, but certainly, say in your school or your business, and definitely in your home, there's still a local area network, probably Wi-Fi that makes sense. Next asset is some storage that maybe the company has. There's no question that storing is going to be in the cloud nowadays, not just backup, but just full sort of cloud infrastructure. The next asset, we'll say, is your website. So you probably use your website, say, to sell things or certainly to advertise what you're doing. There might be a portal there. Who knows? But it's an important asset. Next one is business support. Again, probably in the cloud. That's how you pay your employees. That's how you do your finances. That's where you keep sort of the business activity, invoicing, all that sort of thing. And then finally, email and calendar is important. It might be Office 365 or whatever. So you can see that a typical small business looks like this, right? I mean, that's what they look like. It's distributed, it's hybrid in the sense that I have some local area and I have some cloud. it's resilient in the sense that if one cloud goes down, I've got others. Like I'd like a lot of these as a service capabilities to be on some sort of diverse infrastructure. And as I'm building my threat asset matrix, you can see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different categories there that we're looking at. So if we assume the CIA model, how many threat cells are there going to be in the threat asset matrix? 7 times 3, 21. So we have 21 little risk management projects that now we're going to run on behalf of this company. Do you follow? Again, it's profound because it allows us to structure the work, to figure out how to do cyber, figure out how to stop hackers. This is how you do it. You don't do it by just whipping crypto at something. You don't do it by pen testing. You don't do it by just hacking yourself and having a list and go, there, I found the problems. You do it systematically. So the defender, the cyber defender, decomposes the assets, 7 categories, maps them against the different threat types. Now we have 21 different possibilities. And for each one, we're going to do a risk management activity and decide what needs to be done. What kind of security functionality do we introduce? What kind of procedural controls? What kind of policies or penalties? Or what do we just decide we're going to punt on totally because you're only going to have X amount of dollars to do it anyway? It's like an operations research problem, right? Here are the problems, here are the solutions, here's a bag of money. I guarantee you don't have enough money in the bag to fix all the problems. There, go have at it. That's what this is all about. I hope that makes good sense. And again, as you're doing this, the idea is for the asset decomposition to match the setting as we've done here in this case. It's not just hardware, software information. That's kind of dopey. That's generic. That we use that just to explain the concept. When we do threat asset matrices, we look specifically at the infrastructure of interest, and we break it into different categories that make sense. So I hope this has been fun. We're going to go in the next video. We're going to start actually doing something with this little example. So we'll see you in the next one. Hi folks. So in this video, what we're going to do is build on the example network that we started with in a previous video. So we laid out the different assets that exist in a typical network. We came up with 7. And we'd agreed that we would take those 7, map them against the 3 threat types, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, denial of service, and come up with a matrix. So that's kind of cool. It gives us the ability now to look at each one. So let's look row by row. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat a little bit. When you're watching a cooking show and the cook just brings out the cake and it's all made, and he's had you make that, well, they made it before. So I've already gone through and in my own mind done a risk management assessment for each of the different cells. Let me try and justify some of them. I won't go through all 21, but we'll go through a handful of them. I'll try and justify where I think they came from and help you understand how you might do it. And by the way, you do not have to agree. You may decide that something else is important. Remember, we were talking about, determining asset priority in a previous discussion, and I had you running into your house picking up, what you thought was important. Well, you might do something different than, say, your roommate. You run in and grab one thing, your roommate grabs something else. So it's not that there's no right answer, because there are some answers that don't make a lot of sense. Like if your roommate runs into a burning house and takes a newspaper out, you're going to say, what did you do that for? There's almost no justification for that. But if you grab cash and your roommate grabs an important book, they're both justifiable. So that's something I want to make sure you have in your mind as you work through these exercises, as you do the system security analysis, as you become an expert security consultant, making a whole bunch of money, doing consulting work. You want to be able to justify your answer. You want something that is reasonably justifiable. That makes sense? If you can do that, I'm happy. As long as you can justify, I'm happy. If You can't justify, I'm not happy. So let's go to the first one. So mobiles. In a typical enterprise, today I put confidentiality, integrity, and availability low. Now, I totally disagree with that. The reason I put it low is because I think all the interesting stuff is happening out in the cloud. So your mobile, and I've spent almost a lifetime in mobility, is a window into other assets. So it's important. Look, I walk 30 seconds without my mobile. I feel like I'm in a panic, but it's not the mobile, it's what it represents. So the ability to access things is really what's critical. So for me, the way I've interpreted this is that the information that I grab, that's where I'm going to be placing highs and mediums. But the mobile itself, for me, I decided has been low. You may disagree, but I can justify it. PCs. I made confidentiality and integrity a little bit higher only because most of you watching me right now tend to store a lot of interesting stuff on your PCs. You just do. Like if you're a hacker and you have your choice of where to steal things from, you're always going to pick the PC because the PC has tons of files, directories, information, your tax forms, whatever. There's probably a treasure trove of interesting stuff there. Whereas the mobile, yeah, not so much, but you might use the mobile to gain access to things that would exist in the cloud. So I put the PCs a little higher. Local area network, I put it low across the board. I think your local Wi-Fi, yes, somebody can maybe listen into Wi-Fi, and maybe the nasty kid next door is using your Wi-Fi to go out and surf the internet or whatever. It's a risk, it's not zero, but I put it at low. Storage. I think this is a little bit more interesting now. Like if we decide that the company that we were sort of positing in our 7 asset kind of characterization, let's say they're in the business of writing software. Most companies nowadays are. It's hard to find any company now in any industry that's not writing software of some type that's part of their intellectual property. Well, the storage software is probably the most important thing they do. And I said certainly then the integrity of that software as it resides in storage is supremely important. There's no question about it. I said low availability. Look, if this was a service provider, let's say this was your local phone company or telecommunications company, you might decide that storage would be a little bit more important from an availability perspective, but I'm just making the assumption that it's not. Email calendar, I just put across the board as medium. There's a lot of confidential stuff that gets sent around in email. You want to make sure that's protected. Here in the United States, we just had an election where some hacking into email was pretty consequential. So you'd never put that as zero, but I don't think there's too many companies that would say that email and calendar would be their top risks. I put them at medium. Business support, again, high integrity. Your financials are embedded in there. You don't want people mucking around with that. That is absolutely critical, keeping that. Now, you might say that if customer lists are in there, you could justify that being high. I didn't, but you could. You could make that determination, in which case you might go medium to high. And then finally, your website. I think that for most companies, this is about the most important asset. It's your customer-facing visibility. If you're an e-commerce site, it's where you do business. So I said high in terms of confidentiality and integrity. So again, you see my thought process here. I said I was cheating. I already baked the cake. If we were doing this together, we'd be doing a threat tree, doing a full risk analysis under each cell, maybe doing it as a team, really coming to some consensus about what we think would be the appropriate ratings. And notice, another shortcut is low, medium, high, right? I just picked that as a very simple scale. You might decide that you want to pick a scale from 1 to 10 or from 1 to 1,000 if you really want some sensitivity. If you were doing this for a nuclear power plant, do you think it would be overkill to have scales from 1 to 1,000, to have big teams doing the risk assessment in each of the different threat asset matrix components, and really coming to a general consensus that you've properly characterized risk? That's how it's done. If you were wondering, if you think, how do you possibly do security in something like a nuclear power plant? This is it. I'm showing you, okay? This is not familiar to most of you. You're looking at this going, this is not, what is this? This is not cybersecurity, but I'm showing you, this is how you do it. You make determinations, risk management determinations. Now, behind all of this, as you'll see in the next video, we're going to make some decisions about what to do. And that's where we start talking about the things that are familiar. So, for example, if we decide to put cryptography somewhere, well, it's going to be driven by this. I'm not going to put cryptography somewhere for the heck of it. By this, would I be encrypting all the mobiles? Is that where I'd spend my money? If I have $1 to spend on something, am I putting encryption on the mobiles? No. I'm doing something probably about the integrity of some of my important assets and the website. You get the point? So you're going to be making those decisions, and you'll see that coming up. But now let's do a little quiz here, just as a little test of our understanding of how this works. So we said, what justifies making the mobile piece low and then the website high? We said hackers don't care, mobile information beaconed, website information might include some important products or things, and then mobile Android. The answer is C, right? I mean, the fact that the website probably includes so much consequential information for your company makes me say hi. Now, if you run a website that's just a little marketing thing with nothing important, and if it got knocked out, you wouldn't care less, then you wouldn't put high, you'd put a lower point. Remember, it's all about this being justifiable, not about being correct or incorrect, that it be justifiable. So in the next video, we'll go on and we'll start learning a little bit about how safeguards connect up with the risk analysis activity. So I'll see you in the next one. Hi folks, so the topic of this video is mapping assets, threats, vulnerabilities, and attacks. And I want to start with a little story. I had a group come into my office some number of years ago, and they were pitching some security consulting and analysis work that they were doing and thought that I might have some interest. So I asked them what they do, and they said immediately that what they do is they start by looking at attacks and characterizing the number of attacks that are possible to infrastructure, and then they come up with a list of the vulnerabilities, and they work their way back to how this kind of affects business. And I remember thinking to myself, they've got that exactly backwards. And the reason is that the number of possible attacks to anything is infinite. So what does this mean? It means that if you're trying to do security analysis and trying to understand the security of a system, the two places you're going to have trouble, attacks and vulnerabilities. The reason is because both sets are infinite. Now, we said earlier that we kind of like grounding ourselves in assets and threats because those are finite sets. When we get into attacks and vulnerabilities, they're infinite. So what do? Like if the number of attacks is infinite, what do you do? Now, you can learn a little bit from medicine. Think about the way your doctor gives you advice. Let's say you go to the doctor and you say, Doc, I'm not feeling so good. Got any advice? What's your doctor going to say? Doctor's going to say, well, look, you probably ought to lose a little bit of weight. Maybe you ought to quit smoking. Probably should improve your health a little bit. How about running, a little exercise? There's some things we can do that make sense. And I think you would agree that these are things that make good common sense and are probably going to stop diseases you never even heard of. Does the doctor say, well, here's what we're going to do. Like, this is what you hope they don't do. Let's make a list of every disease we can come up with from 1 to 1,000,000, and let's just check off each one and make sure that we're good and that we don't have that disease. You would think that's utterly ridiculous. And yet, half the people listening to me right now, if someone were to ask you, how do you do cybersecurity? You'd say, we try and find attacks and make sure that we don't have problems from this attack, right? You would hire hackers to come in and they go, look, I can break into you this way and I can break into you that way and I can do this thing. And you'd go, oh my gosh, 1 disease, 2 disease, 3 disease. Wow, I don't have those diseases. I must be well. It's just as ridiculous for cybersecurity to do that as it is for your doctor to make a list of diseases versus starting with more broad kinds of things, like I said, with assets and threats. So when we do the cross product of assets, threats, that's finite, Once we introduce vulnerabilities, it's an infinity. Once we introduce attacks, it's an infinity. Keep that in mind. I've got a chart that you probably see right now that shows the 4 sets. Shows 2 of them finite, 2 of them infinite. What this will mean as we start thinking about different types of cybersecurity technology and safeguards in subsequent videos and courses, should you decide to stay with us, is that you just can't ground them in vulnerabilities and attacks. Doesn't make sense. There's too many of them. You can't do it that way. You have to do it in a way that makes sense, that has broad, complete coverage around protecting the assets that are important to you. So kind of through this first course, I hope it's been sort of clear to you that keeping track of things by looking at different sets of things and whether they're finite or infinite, doing cross products, and analyzing the components in a cross product, this is the stuff that system security engineers are made of. This is the way we provide complete system security analysis. And again, in the context of threats and vulnerabilities and attacks, the conventional view has always been to start there, to start hacking, finding problems, and fixing them. I'd like you to look at that upside down. I'd like you to say, wait a minute, it makes no sense to be doing these quote-unquote penetration tests or white hat hacks. Those are useful, but they're not useful for demonstrating the absence of things. I think I said in a previous discussion, I'll repeat it here. Any type of testing for vulnerabilities and attacks is good at demonstrating the presence of whatever it is you found. Like if you posit to me, I have 0 vulnerabilities, and then I find one, then I've shown you that you're wrong. But if you ask me then to say, what are all the vulnerabilities, and I start finding them, I have no way of ever proving that I've gotten them all. That's foundational. It's something that I want to make sure you have in your mind. So keep all of this in mind as we go through this. We go through technology. I hope you'll stick with us through the remaining courses. It's been wonderful chatting with you, and we'll see you next time.